Okay, just to put some perspective, I was born in 1977. 2 years later, satellites were already able to monitor on a spatially and temporally continuous way many aspects of the Earth system. In 1979, we have the first complete spatially explicit image of the Arctic minimum extent at that time. That's how it looked like. This is September 2012. You can see that things have changed quite a lot. September 2012 is not, it's definitely an outlier in the sense that it's the minimum, but it's not an outlier overall. If we look at the overall trends of Arctic sea ice extent in the polar regions. This plot here shows you the annual cycle of area occupied by sea ice in the Arctic, which goes from a winter maximum of about 15 to 16 million square kilometers to a summer minimum, which happened in September after the warm season, which used to be around 5 or 6 million square kilometers, and it's now around 4, sometimes below. So in about 30 years we have lost, well, 40 years we have lost over 3 million square kilometers of sea ice. Not only we have lost area, we have also lost volume. The remaining sea ice is much thinner, so overall we have lost about 10,000 cubic kilometers of sea ice during these last 40 years. This is a huge change, probably one of the largest changes in the Earth system that we have experienced in the last decades. And it's a huge component for a characteristic that the Arctic region has, which is its climate hypersensitivity. Due to the feedbacks linked with sea ice and snow, when the Arctic warms up, it warms up much faster than the global latitudes. In this plot here of average temperatures, in blue you have the Arctic temperatures, and in red or brown you're having the global averages. You can see that when the trends are up, the pace is much faster. This would be starting in the late 19th century up to the present. More or less, we could say that the Arctic is warming at least twice the rate of warming than the global average. This is called the Arctic amplification, which means that things like the 2 degrees threshold or the 1.5 degree thresholds that we are trying to agree at the COP meetings are already surpassed in the Arctic. So we are living in a, I wouldn't say a new normal, because we are not in any normal. We still don't know where we're heading. The trends are still there. So what does this mean? Well, it means way too many things. The most obvious one is what's going to happen with all these changes in the Arctic to the natural system, in the Arctic, to the Arctic biota. Not only the Arctic biota, much of it adapted to sea ice, but also the Arctic weather and climate, which actually goes beyond the Arctic into affecting us all. Arctic warming also carries with it big changes in the permafrost, in the permanent frozen ground. And not only that, all these things are affecting Arctic inhabitants, many of which have traditional livelihoods which are being completely modified by the current changes. And they are making the Arctic more accessible. The fact that the Arctic is more accessible means that, for example, some global trade routes are starting to take place along the northern Arctic seas, which are more and more free of ice. You're having much more accessible lands and oceans to natural resource extraction, and the whole of these Arctic changes are bringing geopolitical changes. The Arctic has shifted from marginality to centrality for many states, way beyond the Arctic states. Singapore is interested in joining the Arctic Council, for example. You couldn't imagine a least Arctic state than Singapore, located at the equator. So what does this mean? Well, this is a bit overwhelming. It means that we need a lot of expertise from many fields to really understand what's going on in this region and its impacts for its local nature, natural resource extraction, and societies. That basically requires a lot of research from many fields, and we happen to have it in Oxford. These are just a few pictures of people who have either worked with the Arctic or are working with the Arctic or the polar regions in general in the past or in the present. Many of them are completely focused on it, on this research. Others have projects that deal with it. But in all, we are dozens of people sharing polar research projects in Oxford across the three divisions of humanities, social sciences, and life sciences, and mathematics and physics. We don't only have the experience now, but we have a long history of polar expeditions and polar research in Oxford. These are pictures of a 1923 expedition to Svalbard. Members of this expedition included Charles Elton, the famous ecologist, who actually wrote quite a lot about the Svalbard ecology. And back in the early 20th century, Oxford was really interested in conducting research there. However, Oxford is not really identified globally as an Arctic or as a polar hub. We are many, but we are not organized. We don't have a go-to place or a go-to resource that identifies us as a polar institution, contrary to other places which are really highlighting this expertise. That's why I applied for money from the Inspiration Fund to have a first step towards actually creating or highlighting this community, which would be the creation of a website. This website is running, but needs to be more updated and populated. That's why we have. That's why I have these resources that I'm in the process of using, and it includes a list of all the people who work on polar research within the university, an up-to-date publication page, and other resources, and aims to be eventually the go-to place for polar researchers from the university and polar interested people who want to know what's going on in Oxford related to these regions from all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Very nice. Now, when I was a student in Oxford many decades ago, I used to walk past the Sheldonian Theatre and see these large featureless lumps sticking on top of stone columns. Our next award went to Martin Coombes to do something very interesting with the emperors around the Sheldonian Theatre. Martin.